The generation that he came out from were people who were Pan-Africanists by the virtue of the fact that the generation of their parents had built the African Union, the AU. He had gone to school in Madagascar as an army officer. He'd been around, even in his 20s. So there was nothing foreign to him about other African states. And he seemed to be a progressive individual. Largely his theories were socialist, but they were practical, pragmatic things. You need to have people educated. So he had to make literacy available, adult literacy projects. So he did that. And of course he was anti-imperialist. And he was also a person who who wanted to set a good example by living a life that was, within the means, the financial means. So he didn't, he made a show of actually walking around, even though he was head of state, or using a bicycle, or using a small car. So yeah, he was a good guy. Unfortunately, he was killed in a coup by one of his colleagues, Kampaore. But he set a good example for all Africans. I went to school with too many kids who were named after him, Sankara. I had one of my cousins named Sankara, another's named Mandela. So, yeah, his greatness is in the fact that he went to ground and respected people and loved people, And he died young, too young, Had he lived longer, maybe Africa would be a different place. And he was brave, he didn't fear to speak. He spoke very bluntly about what had to be done, how the French had colonized Africa, and how they were, and things that, and I think they sponsored his removal. But remember that Sankara was part of a generation of many people like him, and thousands of the people like Sankara died. These are young army officers who graduated in the late 60s and early 70s from high school and university, who then died in the revolutionary times in the 70s and 80s and 90s, which were very unstable in Africa because people were, governments were changing constantly. So yes, that's what I can say about Sankara. I think that what we need to do as Pan-Africanists now is to make sure that we celebrate these people and that they are not forgotten. And I'm glad you asked the question, because really it's very sad to talk about Pan-Africanism or African development in general without giving a shout out to these people. But now I'm wondering, where is his family? How are they doing? Because we actually just tend to lionize people and valorize their names, but we don't do anything for them materially to keep their name alive, and that's a problem. And I'll give you an example, which ties in with the other person you asked about. There's a question you asked me about Dedan Kimathi. I saw there was a question here. Please explain the tactics the Mau Mau used to fight the British. Please speak about the greatness of Dedan Kimathi, which is the same question of talk about the greatness of Thomas Sankara. Dedan Kimathi, of course, was one of the leaders of the Mau Mau movement in Kenya. And the reason I want to talk about him in conjunction with Thomas Sankara is that Dedan Kimathi also died in his 30s. I think he was 36, which would have been slightly older than Sankara at the time of his death. So these were young men. They would have been the age of you people. When Mandela came out of prison in 1991, one of his first trips across Africa was to go to Kenya. And they received him. And at that time, I think I was living in Kenya. Yes, I was living in Kenya. And one of the things that he asked the people who were showing him around is, I want to see the family of Dedan Kimathi. And they had to look for it. They didn't know where they were. They did not know where Dedan Kimathi's family was, and they took him to, eventually after a few days or hours, they tracked a woman down, his wife, in a small village somewhere where she was decrepit. She had been living in utter poverty, while Kenya was continuing with its independence project, which Dedan Kimathi's, Dedan Kimathi was partly responsible or largely responsible for the independence in Kenya and for the freeing of the rest of Africa, because the British Army broke its back in Kenya. The Mau Mau War did that. So they had to imprison 1/3 of all the Kikuyu men during the Mau Mau War. 30% of every Kikuyu man alive on the planet was in prison at one point because of Dedan Kimathi's methods of fighting. Not only in Kenya, but when Lumumba's people were fighting here, there was a whole division of young Kenyans called the Jeunesse Gikuyu, who were part of the Mau Mau, who came through here, where you're sitting now. They went and they crossed into Congo and fought for Lumumba. They never came back. This place we're sitting was a refugee camp at one point for Mau Mau people. People were displaced by Mau Mau. I was lucky in the sense that I have a connection with Dedan Kimathi personally. One of his nieces is married to my brother. Dedan Kimathi families are my in-laws now, right? So yeah, that's for me now, it's no longer some academic thing. This is my family member now, right? And so my nephews, their grandparent is the brother of Dedan Kimathi, or this is their family. It's not very far from me, right? I have to explain that to them every once in a while. So that's Dedan Kimathi's situation right there. I know that in Kenya they have sort of revived that idea. They now talk about him, and there's a statue now in his honor. But for many years after Kenyatta took over and Daniel Arap Moi, there was no mention of Kimathi or the Mau Mau. It was a shameful chapter in their view, because they reconciled themselves with the British and they were shy to talk about Mau Mau. But it's over now. I mean, Mau Mau is a big thing. It's come back in terms of understanding it. And there's a lot of studies about that. And I also know that there has been class action suits filed against the British for the torture they inflicted on the Kenyans in the 50s and the 60s. And I think that some people have been paid compensation already. Yeah. But the Mau Mau War is what caused the British to surrender the colonies they had here and the protectorates all over Africa. And so that's the greatness of this person. Sankara's example has been so widely followed that even the recent military coups in West Africa, they have not been executing people. And the latest person to do the coup has been very clear and said, they should not compare him to Sankara. He is a person who... Sankara has become a sort of a saint in the eyes of many Pan-Africanists. So, yeah, I think that both of these people are great, and they're great examples, obviously. Yeah. And in my heart, as a person who's kind and reasonable, I can't say that I would have used the same methods, but then I wasn't alive then, and I don't know if they had a choice. But when Dedan Kimathi took over, they actually went and killed friendly British people. And they made people swear oaths, which were done in very ritualistic stuff that wasn't initially part of Kikuyu culture. And these rituals were pretty grotesque, maybe. And of course, executing friends first, as in order to make it clear to the enemies that if we can do this to our friends, you're not anywhere. So they killed white people. Even white people who were on their side, who would help them. They also executed one of the chiefs in Kikuyu land, who had been a chief, of course, under the colonial government, but in a very public execution, which then criminalized the Mau Mau. So they had brutal methods, yeah, I have to say that. Well, not everything was such an extreme fashion, but they also trained Africans at the time to see themselves as, equivalents in terms of the ranking system that the British were using. They were all generals and captains and majors, and they used the same system. Also, they had a council. The high command was very democratic. They actually used to vote and pass resolutions as a group, and they picked their commanders democratically like that. So they practiced a form of democracy in the Mau Mau. And of course, the most significant Mau Mau commander who survived, Mweriama, I think is his name, was an important person in the life of Kenya's development. But he died eventually of snake. He tried to save somebody who'd been bitten by a snake, and he ended up getting poisoned, accidentally poisoned himself by drawing the blood out of his mouth. But the Mau Mau, yeah, not Dedan Kimathi. I think he was a gentleman called Mariama, I think. A lot of the people who are contemporaries of Dedan Kimathi are still alive, and they're impressive individuals. There's a book that's come out about who's who in Kenya. They're not in it, but they should be. And maybe one of the things we could do is maybe we take an episode one day and we just list these people and have their pictures inserted and have people know who they are. Yeah. So I would say that beyond the shock value of what they did, there were other things about the Gikuyu resistance that was key to the survival of Africans. Unfortunately, Dedan Kimathi died when he was young, but there's a street named after him in Kenya. Yeah, Kimathi Avenue. I think even in Uganda, Kampala has a Kimathi Avenue, no? Yeah, there's a Kimathi Avenue here, so yeah. But again, the problem is we need to study to talk about the totality of their tactics, because if you only see the violent, brutal part, you miss the part that actually worked in terms of creating cohesion in the community. But as usual, the fighting is not normal in the sense that African societies were subjected to such horrible conditions that they were forced to go to war. But war is to be despised and stopped. So we don't need to look back and say we need to have war all the time. We should not have war. So it's not something I need to look back and say, it's a great time. War comes and then you fight it, but it's not a normal thing and it's not a usual thing to go and kill people. So it's always the last resort, but in reality it should not be an option.
Well, let me hear you say, man.